So, we have finally started to see a lot of companies back down from just shoving out as many live service games as possible. It took them long enough, but it really does feel like live service games are getting cancelled left and right these days. And I mean, this makes sense. We've seen so many major flops in just the last few years alone, with a lot of these games having just absurdly massive investments of hundreds of millions of dollars and years of development time behind them, only to end up flopping and basically making no money at all in a matter of months, if not weeks. And I mean, it makes sense that so many companies were chasing this trend, like, sure, and I'm sure plenty will continue to do so even after these massive shutdowns, but because it's like, if you do manage to make one successful live service game, then that could be incredibly lucrative. Everybody wants to be the next Final Fantasy XIV MMO or the next Helldivers or Warframe or whatnot. But a lot of these companies have been learning the hard way that it is just not as easy as just trying to copy a popular formula and then throwing money at the problem. But I think it is also worth looking back at how we even got to this point in the first place. Because if so many of these games like Concord and Highguard and whatnot all flopped so hard the second that they were released, well then how was it even possible that the studios making these games were somehow unaware that this might happen until it was too late? Now, a term that gets thrown around a lot around these games is toxic positivity, and that seems to generally refer to a refusal to listen to negative feedback. With Concord specifically, the game was allegedly stated internally to be the future of PlayStation, with Star Wars level potential and things like that, and according to some interviews, the higher-ups just flat out ignored any internal feedback that went against those narratives because they were just so sure of Concord's success. And this isn't even something that was unique to Concord. If anything, it just kind of revealed a trend that's been going on behind the scenes. A lot of these projects seem to have at least a similar mentality where the higher-ups are just so certain of their game's success that their investment is going to pay off, that naturally whatever game they're working on is going to bring in a more $1 billion in its first week, only to end up being hit by cold, hard reality as soon as they launch and have anybody who doesn't work for them actually give them feedback on their product. It's not even exclusive to live service games. A rather infamous part of that Pagliarulo game design speech that everybody was referencing a few years ago involved him casually talking about gleefully ignoring the negative reviews for Bethesda games. And yeah, that was almost certainly meant mostly as a joke, but still, either way, it seems pretty straightforward to see what a common problem is. Obviously, just flat out ignoring feedback is just not a healthy mentality to have when developing a game, or really running any kind of business for that matter. If I'm a head chef and people are complaining about the food in my restaurant, maybe I should investigate those complaints instead of just hoping that things magically get better if I ignore them. However, the solution to this problem I don't think is quite as simple as just saying, listen to the feedback, stupid, and then calling it a day. Because to be fair, there is often a fairly good reason for why so many developers grow this mentality of ignoring feedback. And that's because a lot of people's feedback is really dumb. Like, okay, that could sound a bit harsh, but it is also kind of true sometimes. Trust me, if you have ever worked on a large-scale project where you get regular consumer feedback, whether we're talking about a game or more general software engineering or just anything of that sort, you will quickly realize how wrong the saying of "the customer is always right" is. The issue is that a lot of the time, people just really don't understand what it is that they don't like about something, and so as a result, it can become extremely easy to just want to ignore a lot of that feedback because it's clearly just flat out wrong. However, the longer version of that phrase, I think, actually provides a little bit more useful insight. The version I prefer is "the customer is always right" when it comes to matters of taste. Some people argue that this is actually the original version of the quote, but ironically, that doesn't seem to be true from what I can find, but regardless, I do think that this is a more useful version of the saying, and it's relevant to get at the point that I'm trying to make here. And that point is that when you're evaluating feedback on your work, it's not enough to just take it at face value or dismiss it entirely if it seems off base, because I think that you should take a more investigative approach to examining feedback. Sure, sometimes it really is as simple as listening to your audience, and it can help a lot if you keep good documentation and gather data on your player base and things like that. If people are complaining that a character or weapon is underpowered or something, and then you pull up the spreadsheets and yeah, it's got a low win rate, then it probably is underpowered and you should probably just buff it. But oftentimes it's nowhere near that simple. Another rather infamous case was this one time I recall from a old Wolfenstein game where players were complaining that the main machine gun for the Axis team was significantly worse than the equivalent machine gun on the Allies team. And this was particularly strange because mechanically, the guns on both teams were identical. Like, they would look like different weapons. The Allies had a Thompson submachine gun where the Axis had an MP40, but in terms of the actual stats, the range, damage, fire rate, etc., the two weapons were mechanically the same. And this was true for basically all the weapons in the game. You know, every side has a pistol and a shotgun and whatnot. Like, they were just mechanically the same, but they would have different appearances, you know, for flavor. So in theory, the weapons should have been perfectly balanced for both sides, which means that it would be very easy to just thoughtlessly throw out this feedback and then call it a day. Obviously, the players must just be wrong. However, when the devs actually looked at the match statistics that they were collecting, it did actually appear that the Thompson was legitimately more powerful and getting more kills more consistently than the MP40. And there didn't seem to be a bug or anything that was causing the damage numbers to get skewed one way or the other. So it just didn't seem to make any sense. And well, if you want a more in-depth look at this story, there is a video that I believe People Make Games did that is a more in-depth deep dive on this topic specifically. But the long and short of it was that it turned out that people actually just really liked the sound effects that the Thompson was making compared to the MP40. And because those sound effects felt more powerful and were just a lot more punchy and pleasing to the ear, people subconsciously ended up thinking it was more powerful and ended up using it more effectively than its counterpart, which just sounded weaker, and as a result, people used it less effectively because they just thought it was worse. So, to fix this issue, they literally had to improve just the sound effects of the MP40 so that it felt as powerful as its respective counterpart, even though they didn't actually change any of its stats. So this is kind of what I mean when I'm talking about having to take a more investigative approach to understanding feedback, and about that phrase that I said. You know, the customer was, in fact, technically right about the feel of the weapons, even though they were completely wrong in their assessment of the problem. But the issue still nonetheless impacted the game's balance in a significant enough way for it to matter. Thus, there really was an actual problem that needed to be solved, and the developers would have never seen it if they were just looking at the raw numbers or trying to take this feedback more literally. There's another example along these lines that I remember from a long time ago, but I can't quite remember or track down exactly what game it was, so if I can find the details, I'll add them in post. But basically, the issue was that people were complaining that the enemy AI in some shooter was just too stupid and brain dead. It was too easy to overwhelm them with basic fire, and it just didn't seem to have any kind of actual, you know, tactical thinking or strategic depth. And so a lot of the QA testers and whatnot of the time want the developers to go back and make the AI smarter. And if you take this feedback at face value, this is not a small small task. NPC behavior is an extremely complicated part of game development, and trying to actually incorporate more in-depth tactical behaviors can take months, if not years of work, depending on how complicated your game is. So, again, this would be another kind of easy feedback to just dismiss outright, not necessarily because it's invalid, but because implementing it would be incredibly impractical. But I recall that what happened instead was that the developers just gave the enemies a little bit more health and made their guns do a lot more damage on the default difficulty mode. And when they gave this version of the game to the playtesters, they immediately got much more positive feedback, with the testers specifically saying that they thought the AI felt a lot smarter now because it felt a lot harder to beat. So again, the playtesters here weren't completely wrong in their judgment. There was a problem with the enemy design, and they were not having fun fighting them in their original state. But they just misdiagnosed the issue because there clearly was something worth changing. They didn't need the AI to be smarter, they just needed it to be more challenging, and thus force the player to maybe think a little bit more tactically or play a little bit more conservatively, which in turn makes the enemies feel more threatening and like they are a more imposing force, even though their behavior hasn't actually changed at all. And thus we avoid having to completely reprogram a totally new AI system from scratch. I wish I could remember what game this was in reference to, but I just can't seem to find it. But hey, if anybody in the comments is able to remember or recognize this kind of story, feel free to let me know down below. But yeah, this is what I'm talking about when I bring up that, the customer is always right in matters of taste quote. People often just have trouble articulating the exact issues they might have with something, but they don't need to be an expert to recognize that they are still having a problem. If I take a bite out of some food and I don't like the taste, I might not be able to name exactly what ingredients are making me not like the dish, but it is still valid for me to say that I don't like the overall flavor. Maybe there's a bug causing the user experience to misalign with what your design says should be happening, or there's an unexpected knock-on effect from multiple systems interacting that you didn't plan for. There's all kinds of unpredictable factors that can arise across a game's development, and players don't need to be intimately familiar with all of your game's code to say that they're not having fun. And sure, sometimes it can be hard. If only a handful of people are complaining about something, it might be a fluke or an actual legitimate misunderstanding. I'm not saying that all feedback is always going to be some enlightening nugget of information. And that's honestly probably why a lot of studios have this problem of ignoring feedback in the first place. Sorting out the useful feedback from the less than useful can be a difficult and tiring process, and that can easily make a lot of people want to just ignore it and throw it out entirely. And a lot of developers just aren't given the time to really process and investigate this level of feedback this intently. I mean, how many horror stories have there been of QA testers that worked on famously buggy or otherwise problematic games, where basically every single time, at least when they're able to talk about it, somebody from QA will point out that they found most of these bugs and other problems in the game's design long before the game hit release. But the game was forced out the door too quickly for anyone to really do anything about it, or they were just otherwise ignored, and their questions and criticisms just went completely unanswered. Basically, what I'm trying to say here at this point is that a lot of the various higher-ups and producers that actually control these circumstances really need to reorient their priorities and really take more feedback into account, especially since creating that environment of toxic positivity where you refuse to acknowledge negative feedback because you just believe in your project so hard, like all of that's going to do is result in fewer people being willing to speak up until it's too late. Silencing your critics may make the room a little bit quieter, but it doesn't actually get rid of the problem. And just in general, you should probably at least try to acknowledge feedback honestly and consider it when you're making updates and changes to your game. Because after all, it doesn't matter if you personally think that everybody else is wrong and all of their critique is invalid because they just don't understand your vision or whatever. Because ultimately, if your goal is to sell your game and make money, and everybody is saying that they have problems with it, well, then you're probably losing a ton of potential sales by ignoring that feedback. So you may as well try to investigate why everyone has all of these problems instead of arguing with your potential customers. A great example that I saw recently while I was brainstorming this video was from a small indie game called Steel Artery. It's this neat little city builder where the gimmick is that you're building your city on a gigantic train that you can move and drive around this continent. It's a cool concept, and I was looking forward to its full release after playing the demo for a bit. But when it did eventually come out, I and many other people ended up finding the game fairly lacking, and the Steam reviews tanked to mixed very shortly after release, with a lot of people, including myself, just having a lot of issues with the game's design and implementation. And this kind of situation can really suck as an indie dev, working on a project for years and years only to have it faceplant on release like this can be soul crushing. And in a matter of days, though, the developer put out a great post talking about this. They actually mentioned that they were tempted to keep trying to argue with the review. Surely this game that they poured so much time and effort into, the customers clearly just didn't understand it properly. It was still good and they just didn't realize its greatness. And I mean, to their credit, there are a number of the complaints that I've seen in those comments that are born from misunderstanding some of the game's more complex and nuanced systems. But that kind of thinking is the kind of thinking that gets us games like Concord, and they recognize that and change their mindset to instead start to accept the criticisms for what they were and really start to actually investigate the real problems that people were having with their game. And as a result, they were then able to promise to put out a new series of updates, first starting with the basic technical stuff to fix some bugs and make some minor quality of life improvements where they can, but then they plan on addressing the deeper criticisms and fixing a lot of the various issues that people have with the game's design in further future updates. And I love this. I myself was one of the people that bought Steel Artery on release and gave it a negative review after playing it for a few hours. But I didn't do that just because I wanted the game to fail or to be done with it or something. And I think many other people, leave these negative reviews because they want the game to be better. They want to leave their feedback in the hopes that the developer actually sees it and then improves the game to make it better than it currently is. And it is great to see such a small developer be willing to take these criticisms to heart without letting it consume them. And I personally am very much looking forwards to seeing where Steel Artery goes from here. At the very least, this mentality is a lot more productive than that time when Starfield came out, and we had developers from Bethesda actively arguing in the review section on Steam that people just clearly didn't understand Starfield's greatness. The astronauts on the moon weren't bored when they went there, therefore exploring empty planets in our game must be just as exciting. God, that was an embarrassment. But seriously, I do think that this concept of taking this investigative approach to understanding feedback, or the lack thereof, really does tie into my recent video where I was talking about the latest Starfield updates, because I do think that Bethesda is at least looking at feedback. Based on some of the interviews and changes that they have made, they clearly are trying to address the things that people are complaining about. But I think that they're only really looking at it at the surface level. They're only taking the feedback literally and not taking this more investigative approach. They see people complaining about how long it takes to get to the various waypoints on each new planet that they explore. So they add the rover so that you can travel across the ground a little bit faster. They hear people complain about, too much fast travel and loading screens in the game's flow. So they let you fly your ship between planets. But these changes don't actually address the core underlying problems that are causing these complaints, which in my opinion is the fact that the world mechanics and the design of the universe just aren't fun to explore in their current state. So changing the speed at which I do that exploration doesn't really change the overall experience that much. Like, it's still boring, it's just faster now. But yeah, as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. Let me know if you know of any other notable stories of developers responding to feedback like this, either productively or otherwise. And if you yourself are a developer or work in any kind of consumer-facing field, feel free to share your own stories in the comments. But for now, if you like the video, make sure to leave me a like and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this in the future. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.